Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, May 28th, 2020. And today we're going to be taking a look at the impact of certain vice presidential candidates on Vice President Biden's campaign for president. So essentially, the model I'm going to be using is from ourprogress.org. They ran through all of these, or at least 5 of the top names for the Democratic vice presidential nomination, and ran their name through key demographic groups and see how they improved amongst voters comparative to Vice President Biden. So Joe Biden starts off in their model with a 74.27% chance of winning the presidency. So I'm going to be referring to that number pretty often because that is a very strong number for Vice President Biden. And every candidate on here except for one actually improves Joe Biden's chances of winning the presidency. So there aren't that many wrong choices according to this model in terms of what could help him win the presidency. But there is one that I think may be a crowd favorite, but at the same time, the numbers don't necessarily reflect her being a good candidate for vice president. And this actually goes against one of my recent videos discussing the need for a woman of color to be on the ticket. A number of analysts do agree with me that a woman of color would be best to offset the Joe Biden ticket, but the numbers don't necessarily agree with that, nor does polling data. Though Elizabeth Warren is favored by a plurality of Democratic voters, I wouldn't necessarily say that means she should automatically be picked because 37% of the Democratic base wants her. But based off these numbers, I'm starting to question my own true beliefs about whether or not a woman of color should be chosen as vice president. I do think that in terms of just the way that it's viewed, optics in general, I think that a woman of color would be very good for the Biden campaign in terms of breaking down barriers. But in terms of electability, it looks like there is one candidate that outperforms the rest of them by a pretty substantial margin. And I'm pretty sure most of you already know who that is. So the first one that is on your screen right now, all of these maps are going to be blue or red in terms of an increase or decrease. Red means that this vice presidential candidate would actually lessen Joe Biden's chances of winning those states, and blue would mean that it necessarily increases the chances of Joe Biden winning in these states. So on this screen, you can see that there's only a couple of states in which this candidate outperforms Joe Biden, at least helps him in some states. And this is Senator Amy Klobuchar from the state of Minnesota. Now, if you look around her centralized area, this is where Amy Klobuchar performs the best. But based off the Rust Belt, this really only helps her in Ohio. It only helps Biden in Ohio, Iowa, and then a number of other states that won't really matter for the overall presidential election. So when we're looking at this electoral map, we see that, not necessarily electoral map, we look at this U.S. map, we see that the Democratic Party would really only be solid in Minnesota if Amy Klobuchar was picked. Every single other state, at least competitive state, is red except for Iowa and Ohio in this scenario, in which Amy Klobuchar mildly helps Vice President Biden. So I really don't think that this is a good scenario for Joe Biden. It lessens his chances down to 69.12% at winning the presidency. It's still a favorite, but anything that's lessening his campaign is something that should be completely thrown out of consideration. Minnesota, a Senate seat which could possibly go to the GOP as a referendum against the newly elected President Biden, and also Amy Klobuchar has a pretty shaky history, and she doesn't really offer that much to minorities or the progressive base, so keep that in mind. As we move over to the next candidate, there's a lot more blue on this map. This is Senator Kamala Harris from the state of California. She improves Joe Biden's chances to 75.19%, so not so much of an increase, but it's still an increase regardless. If you look where she increases Joe Biden's chances, it's pretty much everywhere that matters. Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Michigan. By the way, these are not electoral maps. It's just a heat map in terms of where she improves for Joe Biden. Giving up some of these states, not necessarily giving up, but having weaker chances in some of these states is definitely worth having a vice presidential candidate that improves you in swing states. It doesn't really matter Joe Biden's chances in Montana, in Wyoming, in Tennessee, in Alabama, in Washington, and Oregon, because those states are safe. We know how they're going to vote, and they don't directly impact the outcome of the election in the sense that nobody's really going to be focused on them. But for Senator Kamala Harris, she improves him pretty much everywhere that matters except for the state of New Hampshire. She improves him. She improves for Maine, in Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Really, all of these states with a very large minority presence in the South, or have a key demographic that needs to turn out in terms of voting patterns for 2020. So Milwaukee, Detroit, Philadelphia, areas that were crucial to Obama's victories here in 2008 and 2012, that would be crucial to a Joe Biden victory. So Kamala Harris seems to be improving Joe Biden's chances pretty much around the country. It isn't anything super big. She mainly improves him in the state of Michigan. This is the only one that's pretty solid in terms of improvement, and it also is the state that voted for Trump by the lowest margin in 2016, so that also makes sense. Senator Harris does very well for Joe Biden. Now we have Representative Val Demmings. So she does improve his chances actually to 75.81%. So it actually increases for Joe Biden, larger than Senator Kamala Harris. But if you look around, there's a little bit less blue. And that just comes as a combination. Number one, this is probably very hard for the model to overall put together. Val Demmings has only ran in her representative district, never really statewide or presidential, for the example of Amy Klobuchar and Kamala Harris. So it really isn't super easy to pinpoint that on this overall map, but she does increase Joe Biden's chances in the South. So North Carolina and Florida have a much larger chance of going to the Democratic Party with her on the ticket. This decreases the chances of Joe Biden pretty significantly in comparison to other states in the states of Minnesota, and lowers his chances in Wisconsin, Ohio, and Iowa. New Mexico is going to be pretty solid, so I wouldn't be too alarmed that there's red there. California and a lot of these Democratic states are already going to be solid, so again, won't be super impactful. For Colorado and Arizona and Nevada, these are states that are crucial to Joe Biden, and he's more than likely going to carry all three of those states as well. So the only area that really matters is the Rust Belt, and I would say that this is a little bit of a warning sign. Even though she is increasing his chances in Pennsylvania and Michigan, the lack of support in Wisconsin and drawbacks in Minnesota may not be made up for with victories in the Sun Belt, the Southwest region of the United States. And though Joe Biden's chances in the Sun Belt, so this is the entire Sun Belt increase, you still have to also realize that Donald Trump is more than likely going to carry states such as North Carolina and Georgia and Florida. So if Joe Biden's sacrificing these Wisconsin and Minnesota, in the sense that it's going to weaken his campaign there and already super close states, just to possibly have victories in the South, I wouldn't necessarily say it's worth the risk. We're talking about North Carolina and Georgia and Florida, states that haven't voted for the Democratic Party either since 2012, 2008, or back to 1996, I believe. No, 92. So for these states, even though they are competitive in 2020, I would also say that it's going to be mildly difficult for the Biden campaign to really win an election if they're lacking in the Rust Belt and doing better in the South. Because if the Rust Belt's going red, the South more than likely is going red as well. I wouldn't necessarily say this is worth the risk based off this model. So on your screen now is Stacey Abrams' map. She recently came to political fame after her 2018 governor election, and you can see the areas that she does increase. It's very similar to Representative Val Demmings. You look down in the South, it is increasing for Stacey Abrams, especially in Georgia and North Carolina, especially with large African-American bases that are crucial to Democratic victories in these states. If you look in the Rust Belt, it does increase Joe Biden's chances, and I wouldn't necessarily say Missouri had an interesting poll out today. I want to talk about that one. I'm going to cover Missouri and Utah probably later tonight because they have polls out that show the states being close. They're not going to be close. But looking at the overall electoral map, or at least the USA map, this isn't the electoral map, USA map, Stacey Abrams increases Joe Biden's chances to 78.19%. So it does increase by a pretty significant amount. I would say that this is pretty good news for her, considering that she's pretty much been actively campaigning for the vice presidential spot. Stacey Abrams, while increasing Joe Biden's chances, you also have to realize that, again, the South is not necessarily the pathway to the presidency for the Democratic Party. Yes, she may increase chances in Georgia and North Carolina, but what if they lose those states and they don't necessarily perform as well in the Rust Belt and they're lacking in other states? And I do think that her improving in the Rust Belt is a very good sign for her. I just only think the only real problem with Stacey Abrams is her lack of political experience. Joe Biden is already being toyed around as a possible one-term president at most. If he does win this election, as in not running for re-election, handing it over to his VP. And Stacey Abrams, she doesn't necessarily come with the experience needed. We have representatives and senators on here on this entire list that all have at least some type of congressional experience, possibly even lower level experience. But Stacey Abrams pretty much is a state senator, and that's it. She's only really known for her loss in the Georgia governor's race, and whether or not that was a real loss or not, because of the numerous voter suppression charges in the state of Georgia, I wouldn't necessarily think that people would be super comfortable with her filling in for Joe Biden in the event that Joe Biden does resign or hands it over to her in 2024. That's the one thing that I would say is negative for Stacey Abrams. Now, this is the big one. Senator Elizabeth Warren performs the best amongst compared to every single possible vice presidential choice. She drastically increases Joe Biden's chances to the presidency at 84.91%. 85% of a Joe Biden victory, percent chance for a Joe Biden victory to 15% for Donald Trump if Elizabeth Warren is on the ticket. Yes, she is not a woman of color, but the data generally doesn't lie. Looking at the areas that she's increasing Joe Biden's chances in, it's practically everywhere. There's only a few states in which Joe Biden loses support with Elizabeth Warren on the ticket. And I mean, look at the amount of blue on this map. Obviously, this is not an electoral map, but it shows where she is increasing Joe Biden's chances relative to where he already has a pretty good chance of winning. Look at the solid blue increase in Arizona, Colorado, Texas, Wisconsin, Michigan, New Hampshire. These are states that are competitive, and Elizabeth Warren on the ticket drastically increases Joe Biden's chances at winning these states. If you look, there's even more blue in Georgia, in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, in Minnesota, in Nevada. I mean, these are states in Florida. These are states that are previous Donald Trump states in 2016, and all of a sudden now are looking very, very good for Joe Biden in 2020 if Elizabeth Warren is on the ticket. I mean, she is doing very similar things to what Val Demmings and Stacey Abrams and Kamala Harris are doing. It's pretty much taking the best of all of the four previous candidates and putting them all together into one candidate. And yes, Elizabeth Warren is a white woman, but she also, number one, appeases the progressive base. You also do have to worry about the Bernie Sanders supporters who may blame her, but if they're agreeing with her policy, a vote is a vote. And then you also have to think about the fact that she does inspire young voters. And she, while may not be a woman of color, is doing very well amongst African-American voters, as this model predicts. And I think this is very good news for Elizabeth Warren as a possible vice presidential nominee. I don't see her on the ticket in terms of confirmed VP choices, VP potential choices, but based off the numbers, I guess she is the best chance, gives Joe Biden the best chance of the presidency. 84.91% is a number that is going to probably haunt the Joe Biden campaign if they lose the election and they didn't choose Elizabeth Warren as the vice presidential nominee. Looking at this map, there is no real defense against Elizabeth Warren as a possible nominee. Pretty much women of color have outperformed all the other possible VP choices except for Elizabeth Warren. So I would say Elizabeth Warren is probably the exception. Though I do think that in terms of just looking at the ticket, I think that a woman of color would serve better for Joe Biden. But also, if their main focus is just ousting Donald Trump, I think Elizabeth Warren is probably the best bet at this point. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. The link to the Twitter thread and the website will be in the description and pinned in the comment section if I hopefully remember. But yeah, so again, thank you guys for watching this video. Comment down suggestions below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all later today.